I had the most terrifying experience of my life while driving back from a friend's place in San Francisco to my home in Los Angeles. I left San Francisco around 7 p.m., hoping to make the 6-hour drive and reach home by around 1 a.m. The first couple of hours were uneventful. I cruised down the I-5 listening to music, enjoying the cool evening air, and occasionally munching on some snacks. As I passed through Gilroy, I decided to take a quick pit stop at a gas station to refuel and grab a coffee to keep me awake for the rest of the drive. It was around 10 p.m. when I got back on the road. The traffic had thinned out considerably, and I found myself driving through long stretches of dark, empty highway. That's when things started to get eerie. I noticed a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just another car on the highway. But the vehicle stayed behind me for an unusually long time. It was maintaining a steady distance, never trying to overtake or fall back. After about 30 minutes of this, I started to feel uneasy. I switched lanes a few times, hoping the car would pass, but it mirrored every move I made. I even slowed down, almost to a crawl, to see if the driver would get impatient and pass me, but they didn't. They just slowed down too. By now, my heart was racing and I felt a growing sense of dread. I decided to take the next exit, thinking I could pull into a well-lit area or even find a police station. As soon as I signaled and moved towards the exit, the car behind me did the same. I took the exit and ended up in a small, deserted town called Coalinga. There was hardly any light, and the place looked like a ghost town. I drove around for a bit, trying to find a populated area, but there was nothing. The car was still behind me, keeping its distance, but always there. In a panic, I drove back onto the highway, hoping to reach a larger, busier town. The car followed me back onto the I-5, never missing a beat. At this point, I was terrified. I called my friend back in San Francisco, trying to stay calm as I explained what was happening. She told me to stay on the phone and head towards Bakersfield, which was the next major city on my route. She also suggested I call 911 if the car continued to follow me. The drive to Bakersfield was the longest hour of my life. The car remained behind me, keeping a constant distance. My friend stayed on the line, trying to reassure me, but I could hear the fear in her voice too. As I approached Bakersfield, the highway began to get busier. More cars appeared on the road, and the bright lights of the city started to come into view. That's when the car finally made its move. It suddenly sped up and passed me on the left, zooming ahead at an alarming speed. I barely caught a glimpse of the driver, a shadowy figure, completely indistinguishable in the darkness. I didn't stop in Bakersfield. I drove straight through, not wanting to take any chances. My friend stayed on the phone with me until I was well past the city and felt safe enough to hang up. The rest of the drive was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. When I finally reached home around 2 a.m., I was exhausted and shaken. I double-checked all my locks before finally collapsing into bed. I never found out who was in that car or why they were following me, and that's what scares me the most. Last summer, I was driving from Denver to Albuquerque. It's a pretty long drive, so I decided to leave early in the morning to get there by early evening. I wanted to take my time and enjoy the scenery. The first part of the drive was beautiful, with the Rocky Mountains in the background and the open road ahead. Around midday, I decided to take a detour through some back roads to avoid traffic on the interstate. I've always loved exploring new routes, and it seemed like a good idea at the time. I ended up on a narrow, winding road that cut through some pretty desolate areas. There were no houses, no other cars, just endless stretches of barren land and the occasional clump of trees. After a couple of hours, I noticed my gas gauge was getting low. I hadn't seen a gas station in miles, and I started to get a bit worried. I was in the middle of nowhere with no cell service, and the sun was starting to set. I kept driving, hoping to find a town or at least a gas station before it got too late. Finally, I saw a sign for a small town called Tres Piedras. It was about 20 miles off the main road, but I didn't have much choice. I turned off and headed towards the town, hoping to fill up and maybe grab a bite to eat. When I arrived, the place looked like something out of a ghost town. There were a few rundown buildings, a closed diner, and a single gas station. The whole place had a weird, unsettling vibe, but I was more focused on not running out of gas. I pulled into the gas station and got out to fill up. The old pump was creaky and rusty, but it worked. While I was pumping gas, I noticed an old man sitting in a rocking chair on the porch of the gas station's tiny convenience store. He was staring at me intently, which made me feel uneasy. I finished filling up and walked over to pay. The man didn't say a word, just kept rocking back and forth, his eyes never leaving me. I handed him some cash, and he finally spoke in a raspy voice, warning me to be careful on the road ahead. He said it was easy to get lost out there after dark. I thanked him, trying to shake off the creepy feeling, and got back in my car. As I drove out of Tres Piedras, the sun had almost set, casting long shadows across the road. I turned back onto the main road, but it felt different somehow, like I was driving into another world. About 30 minutes later, the road started to narrow and twist even more. The trees grew thicker, and the sky was now completely dark. My headlights were the only source of light, and they barely penetrated the thick woods around me. That's when I saw it. A car parked on the side of the road with its hazard lights on. I slowed down, thinking someone might need help. As I got closer, I could see a woman standing next to the car, waving her arms frantically. I pulled over and rolled down my window to ask if she needed assistance. She looked panicked and said her car had broken down, and she couldn't get any signal to call for help. I hesitated for a moment, remembering the old man's warning, but she seemed genuinely distressed. I offered to give her a ride to the nearest town, and she gratefully accepted. She got in, and we started driving. She introduced herself as Lisa and explained that she had been driving to visit her family when her car suddenly died. As we drove, Lisa kept looking over her shoulder like she was expecting someone to appear out of the darkness. Her nervousness was contagious, and I started feeling on edge too. The road seemed to stretch on forever with no sign of civilization. The trees closed in on both sides, and the darkness felt almost oppressive. After what felt like an eternity, we saw headlights approaching from the opposite direction. I slowed down, relieved to see another vehicle. But as it got closer, Lisa's face turned pale. She started shaking and whispered, "It's them." Before I could ask what she meant, the approaching car swerved into our lane, forcing me to slam on the brakes. The car stopped in front of us, blocking the road. Two men got out, both wearing dark clothes and masks. They started walking towards us, and I could see the glint of knives in their hands. Lisa was crying now, begging me to drive. I threw the car into reverse, but the road was so narrow and winding that I struggled to keep control. The men started running towards us, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Just as they were about to reach us, I managed to turn the car around and floor it. The tires screeched, and we sped down the road, the men's shouts fading into the distance. I didn't dare slow down, even as the road twisted and turned dangerously. After what felt like hours, we finally saw the lights of a small town ahead. I pulled into a well-lit gas station, my hands shaking and my breath coming in gasps. Lisa was still crying, and I tried to comfort her as best as I could. We went inside the gas station and explained what had happened to the clerk, who called the police. The officers arrived quickly and took our statements. They searched the area but couldn't find any sign of the men or Lisa's car. They told us that there had been reports of similar incidents in the area, with travelers being targeted by criminals who used fake breakdowns to lure them in. Lisa thanked me for saving her and offered to buy me a meal at the diner next door. We spent the rest of the night there, too scared to get back on the road. The next morning, the police escorted us to a safer route, and I finally made it to Albuquerque, exhausted but grateful to be alive. I was driving from Chicago to a small town in rural Indiana for a work assignment. I work as a freelance photographer, and there was a farm that needed some promotional photos. I left late in the afternoon, hoping to get there before dark. But as usual, things got delayed, and I didn't hit the road until around 6 p.m. The first part of the drive was fine. I was on the interstate and traffic was light, but as I got closer to the farm, I had to switch to smaller country roads. These roads were narrow, winding, and poorly lit. I had GPS guiding me, but the further I went, the sketchier the signal got. Eventually, I lost it completely. I was somewhere in the middle of nowhere when my car started acting up. The engine began to sputter and then died completely. I managed to coast to the side of the road, but now I was stranded. I checked my phone. No signal. Great. I decided to wait for a car to pass by. It was getting dark, and I wasn't too keen on wandering around in an unfamiliar area. After about 30 minutes, a car finally approached. I waved it down, and thankfully, it stopped. It was an old pickup truck with a middle-aged man driving. He seemed friendly enough and offered to give me a ride to the nearest town. I was hesitant but didn't have much of a choice. I grabbed my camera bag and locked up my car, then climbed into his truck. We started driving and he introduced himself as Earl. He said the nearest town was about 20 miles away and that it was a small, quiet place. As we drove, the conversation was friendly at first. Earl asked about my work and I told him about the photography gig. But then he started asking more personal questions, like where I was staying and if I was traveling alone. I tried to keep my answers vague, but it was hard not to feel uneasy. We drove through some dense woods, and it was completely dark by now. Earl didn't turn on the radio, and the silence between his questions was deafening. After a while, he took a turn onto a dirt road. I asked him if this was the right way to town, and he said it was a shortcut. I didn't have any signal on my phone to verify, so I had to trust him. As we continued down the dirt road, the trees closed in on both sides. It was getting creepier by the minute. Suddenly, Earl stopped the truck and said he needed to check something in the back. He got out, and I watched him walk to the rear of the truck through the side mirror. That's when I noticed something strange. There were scratches and dents all over the truck bed, like it had been through some serious rough handling. My gut was screaming at me that something was wrong. I decided to get out and pretend I needed to stretch my legs. As I did, I glanced around and realized we were in the middle of a dense forest with no sign of a town or even a house nearby. Earl was rummaging around in the back, and I saw him pull out a large wrench. That was it for me. I told Earl I needed to make a quick call and stepped away from the truck, heading towards a small clearing. As soon as I was out of sight, I bolted into the woods. I could hear Earl shouting behind me, but I didn't stop. I ran as fast as I could, branches whipping my face and underbrush snagging my clothes. I had no idea where I was going, but I just kept running. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled upon an old abandoned cabin. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but it was shelter. I ducked inside and tried to catch my breath. My heart was pounding, and I was terrified Earl might have followed me. I waited in the darkness, listening for any signs of him. After a while, I heard the distant sound of his truck's engine starting up and driving away. I waited a bit longer just to be sure, then cautiously made my way back to the road. It was completely dark, and I had no idea where I was. I started walking, hoping to find another car or some sign of civilization. After what felt like hours, I finally saw headlights in the distance. I flagged down the car, and a young couple pulled over. They looked concerned, and I must have looked like a mess. I told them what happened, and they offered to take me to the nearest town. This time, I made sure to keep my phone handy and watched the route closely. They drove me to a small town about 30 miles away, where I was able to call a tow truck for my car and find a motel for the night. The next day, I got my car towed and fixed. I eventually made it to the farm for the photo shoot, but I couldn't shake the feeling of what had happened. I reported the incident to the local police, but without much detail, there wasn't much they could do. I've since invested in a reliable GPS unit and a portable phone charger to make sure I never end up in that situation again. And I'm definitely more cautious about accepting help from strangers on the road. Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.